Hey, friends. Today we are diving into a topic that touches every single one of us, our relationships. Have you ever felt like certain conversations just keep going in circles, or that no matter how hard you try, connections just seem out of reach? Our culture often teaches us that either we should avoid tough conversations or we should push through them with force. But what if there is a better way to communicate with that person that it seems like you just can't get on the same page with? Today, we're talking about transforming our relationships, whether with family, friends, or colleagues, by changing the way we approach conversation. Stick around with me and my special guest because we are going to unpack both the mindset shifts and the practical strategies that can help you to foster deeper, more meaningful connections. And of course, we are going to bring in a spiritual component and some insights that can help to guide these conversations with grace and wisdom and, of course, virtue. So grab your favorite drink, settle in, and let's invite the Holy Spirit into this conversation as we explore how to speak and listen in a way that strengthens our relationships. Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome to the Persistence in Prayer podcast hosted by Catholic mindset coach, wife, mother, educator, and speaker Kylie Hein. Kylie is passionate about helping you deepen your relationship with God through the power of prayer. This podcast is a space for high achievers who want to do it all, but also want to prioritize their spiritual life and grow in faith. Join us as we explore the beauty of persistence in prayer and the transformative impact it can have on our lives. Get ready to discover practical tips, insights, and inspiration to help you develop a daily prayer practice and cultivate a deeper sense of trust in God's plan for your life. Let's journey together towards a more fulfilled and faithful life as we invite the Holy Spirit in. Let's begin.
Do my bag. I'm skiing here. Oh, good. Here we go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Persistence in Prayer. Today, I'm blessed to be joined by Carla Krieman. She has worked for 40 years in banking and is entering a new season of being an author and a coach. She has a particular passion about the simple portal we call our conversations, and that is going to be our main focus today. I'm really excited about this, Carla, because I know how passionate you are about this topic, and the way that you explain it, I think, has just opened up a new world for me in looking at how I view conversations, and I know it's going to do that for everyone else here. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so grateful that you asked me to join this beautiful audience. I think that having experience in the secular world has really been helpful for me to see from different worldviews how people look at communication. And so I'm hoping that I can impart those messages to your great listeners here as well, but really looking forward to it.
And you've really been in the business world for a long time. Do you want to share a little bit about your background and your family?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up right outside of Pittsburgh in a family of 6 kids. My parents were the children of immigrants, and we had a very rich Catholic life. The family was very connected. Most of our activities were around the church. And some of my first conversations that I remember very clearly were sitting around the dinner table listening. And of course, there was a span of 20 years between my eldest sibling and the youngest, and I was number 5. And I do remember very lovingly, fondly remember these conversations that we'd have around the dinner table. Everybody would bring their various experiences in from a wide variety of places. Somebody was in college, somebody was in elementary school, somebody was on a playground, and they would bring these experiences in a way that we would discern them and make sense of them as we integrated the world outside into our Catholic family life. And so I recall my parents, and my mother was very generous and brought beauty into the world. My father in particular, I remember him sort of being a guardian in a way, that when somebody inevitably would say, well, somebody was on the playground and they were ridiculing or marginalizing somebody, and he would always say, well, we don't do that because they're all God's children. We're all God's children. We treat everybody the same. So with all of the things that we have in the richness of the faith, I recall very fondly almost like this armor. And the armor that I had, sort of adorning me as a child, you grow up, and then when you see a departure from that, it's jarring. So I think that has something to do with why communication is important to me. Because I think having that base, which so many of us in the Catholic world and the richness of our faith really does arm us as we enter into the world every day. And even beyond that, it's adoration, it's the sacramentals, it's just this rich deposit, the prayers, it's the rosaries. All of these things create a sort of peace and aura in our worship, so that when we do enter sometimes the secular world where not everybody has that, and they may bring things in that are a departure from that, I think it has something to do with what makes communication stand out for me. There's a certain way to do it. There's a certain set of protocols, and it doesn't have to be Catholic. So what I'm trying to do is sort of translate the two, kind of the intersection of the two in many ways.
I am so thrilled that you brought up family dinner. It's such a simple thing, but it is almost like a lost art in the culture that we live in. I know for me, growing up, family dinner didn't happen every night because the span between ages, just like you said, there was 20 years difference between your siblings. My younger brother is 7 years younger. My sister's 3 years older. Brother above that is 6 years. And then I have another sister who's even further above that. And so when you have all these different schedules and you're participating in all the things, the sports, I went to a small school, so it was not only athletics, but you also had one act plays and all school plays and musicals and band concerts and choir concerts. And then you also had FBLA and FCCLA. Like you just had all of these things and all of these crazy schedules. And then trying to find a singular time for everyone to sit around the dinner table, let alone for someone to cook it.
Yeah.
Didn't happen very often, but like you, I can very distinctly remember Sunday lunches after Mass, especially as I got older and my siblings had moved out, coming home on Sundays. This was before anyone was married or things like that, or even after I moved away to college, driving all the way back home on the weekends. And those Sundays were so sacred to me just because of those conversations, like you said, having those intimate moments with your family members that you don't get throughout the week. And that connection piece is so invaluable. And I love that you brought that up, because I think that we have to take a step back and look at our schedules and see, are we prioritizing this in our own families? Not that it has to happen every meal, every day, but are we actually sitting down at the dinner table and talking, or are we watching a movie and eating snacks and distracted by our cell phones and all of the things?
Yeah. It's so true. And it's interesting you say this, because I consider myself a student of the conversation. It's a lifetime worth of study that you could do about all the different things that play a role in the way that we build our relationships and how we build them through our conversations. And there is actually, in the secular world, there's a very well-known researcher from MIT named Sherry Turkle, and she specifically studies the impact of technology on our relationships and on our conversations. In fact, she wrote a book called Reclaiming Conversations. And one of the things she points out is exactly what you're saying, that the importance of these dinners together. It's not uncommon now that you would go to a restaurant and see a family of 4 or 6 around the table and everybody is on their device. And what she's suggesting is that the failure is around the inability of young people to learn the nuances of communication. You could be sending some message to somebody, and you could be saying the words, but the message that you're sending is quite different. And you might not see it because you can't look at the body language. You're used to looking on your phone. So it's actually so much more, and it's the gravity of it is so significant. And you're right. It doesn't have to be every single day, but the sacredness of it somewhere in the routine is proven time and time again in terms of importance.
I think of that study. I don't know, remember all the details, but I know it talks about even just having your cell phone, for example, on your desk or on the table when you're having a conversation with someone signals a different message than if it's out of sight.
Yeah.
And
Speaking about it.
I'm always aware of that because I am guilty, like I'll have it off, but even just having it there, it is a distraction.
Mhm.
And so I just try to be aware of that in my own life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good, and again, this is a constant learning, and there's some things that I'm attached to, and I have to say these electronics are a culprit for me as well. It's a challenge, but I think that all of these things are playing a role in what we're hearing about in society in terms of the struggle that people have with their relationships. I'm going to emphasize kind of talking about work relationships, but this can be applied anywhere. It can be applied in school. I mean, you just have to, I know you were a teacher, head into the teacher's lounge for a little bit to see the dissonance that exists. I have people very close to me who are teachers, and I understand some of the challenges that exist there. And I don't think you're immune from it in any setting at all, but it's the way we're interacting with one another is not solidifying and nurturing relationships. I think, some people would say, okay, was it the lockdowns, or, this increase in anxiety, the people on more medication, young people are feeling isolated, lots of different things that are impacting our everyday. One of the things that I think is creating some of the dissonance is that our division in general, when you're sitting in a conversation and you're listening to somebody ridicule or marginalize somebody behind their back, a degradation of trust, especially, of course, if they're marginalizing somebody and it happens to be based on an identity that you share. So what does that do to your relationship with that person? In one sense, there are some really great researchers out there, well-known researchers who study marriages, and they've determined that one of the most accurate predictors of relationship failure is contempt, like eye rolling, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
I'm going to talk about some of the things that are sort of an antidote to all these things. One of them is goodwill. And I think of the opposite of goodwill as malice. And somewhere in between, perhaps, is contempt. I'm not a researcher, but this is Salty Carla's kitchen science, right? And so I'm thinking about it as it applies to the workplace and my own relationships. And, I think they're basically saying this is a biggest predictor of relationship failure. I think it'd be applied to any type of relationship. When I think of contempt being brought into a conversation, I think that in some sense, you are bringing contempt and giving permission to everybody in that conversation to also have contempt towards that particular identity or person. And so my question becomes, as I study this, is it the 10th conversation after that, or the 100th, or the 100,000th conversation, where someone is taking the permission that you originally gave them way back when in that first conversation where you expressed contempt? Is that the conversation where someone who has the capacity to do some real evil acts on it because you've given them permission? So again, the gravity of these small interactions is great. But while I kind of highlight all of these ills, I really do believe that there's hope. And the hope lies in this amazing tool that we tend to ignore. It's something that's portable. It's something that can be brought from, school to home to work. Something that's free. It doesn't cost anything for us to use it. We can use it in groups. We can use it to advance a position, to ferret out our differences and to nurture a relationship. And this thing is the conversation. It's the portal that's been given to us really by God. And what is it that we do with this portal? And we just talked about, the fact that we're bringing technology into the portal, and that's impacting our ability to nurture relationships. We're bringing contempt into the portal. And I'm suggesting there's the antidote or some other things, almost mindset changes. And those mindset changes, everybody on this podcast is going to recognize as virtues.
I'm so excited. Okay. I want to go to obstacles first, like obstacles that we run into that hinder our relationships. And then we'll go into these kind of 4 to 5 things that you have about highly evolved communicators. But really quick, I want to pause because you were talking about how someone can overhear a conversation or be part of a conversation, and then 100 conversations later, right?
Yeah.
They go back to what we said. And it just so much reminds me of the different temperaments that we have. And temperaments are not our identity. I talk about this all the time. It's not our identity. But our temperament really begins with how quickly we react to something and how long that lingers with us. So cholerics and sanguines are going to react quickly, but the choleric and the melancholic are going to hold on to that for longer period of time. They're not going to move past it as quickly. And I saw this come up in my teaching sometimes. I would have a student 3 or 4 years later say, "Remember when you said this to me?" And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Right?
Yeah.
Sometimes I'd have 2 or 3 students talking to me at once, right? And you would respond to one, and the other person would think that you were responding. Then they're like, "No, you told me to do this." I'm like, I never would have said that. I cannot imagine that I ever would have said that to you. And my children do this sometimes too. They're like, "You told me." I'm like,
Yeah.
My daughter just yesterday was like, "You told me pencil was spelled this way yesterday." I'm like, "No, I did not."
Yes. Yeah.
But somewhere there was a disconnect. Maybe I wasn't connecting with her. I wasn't looking at her when I was speaking, or I was multitasking, right? There was some sort of disconnect in that conversation, and it stuck with that person. And so I pray all the time for the Lord to forgive me for any time when I just didn't take the time to make that conversation meaningful and let that person know that I heard them and make sure that they understood my intention behind my words, because what comes out of my mouth and what I actually mean sometimes are not the same.
Yes. Very interesting you bring that out. I've been meaning to go out. I've read Alex Havard's book. Do you know him? He studies temperaments. He's got a lot of really rich information, and he brings the faith into it too. So it's really, really good. But I identify with the person who takes, I was always what I refer to as an introverted thinker, where it just, I'd be observing people more than I would be the one talking. And so it gives you time to really understand different behaviors, but it does take you some time to synthesize. It's also more difficult to resurrect the situation again a month later to say, "You know what? I finally figured out that when you said this thing, I feel like you might have meant something," right? So we can talk a little bit about that, because I had to address that in some conflicting kinds of situations. So it's a good call out for sure.
Yes, I love that. And just how many pieces we miss sometimes too. I know for our introverted temperaments, melancholic and phlegmatic, sometimes you hear a piece of a conversation and we automatically think that it's about us, even when it's not. But then we ruminate on that without all of the facts, and we make ourselves miserable. We think that someone hates us or, doesn't value our work or whatever it is. And we're just missing information. So there's just so many pieces to conversation and communication. And I'm really excited to just hear your perspective on all of this.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like you just described me. It's the 3 a.m. rumination time.
You might be melancholic.
I think I am. Wait a minute. And then, but however melancholic becomes salty, that's me. But there's a point to all of it for sure. So lots of different things. Let me just go through what I think the top 5 mindsets are really quickly, and then
Yes.
we can talk about this sort of fictional character, about how she might experience these different scenarios, because it might be helpful.
Beautiful.
I'll just kind of walk through these really quickly, and then we'll talk about my friend Jen, who's a fictional character. So gratitude. Everyone recognizes gratitude, and so I'm seeing more and more the importance of gratitude. So we'll talk about that. I already mentioned goodwill, that oftentimes the opposite of goodwill is brought into conversations. I've been in panels where I've had an audience of 150 people, and I say to all the manipulators in the room, we know who you are. We know who you are. You likely learned how to communicate long before you arrived in this place, right? Some of them are perhaps they had mean girl behaviors in junior high, but nobody actually gave them feedback enough and cared enough about them so that they didn't become the tyrant at age 50. And that's, there's a lot of that, I think, that is going on. These poor people have not gotten feedback. And so their communication is sometimes, if it's an extreme, I think it can be malicious, So goodwill is something that is to be emphasized and something we bring into our conversations to move them forward. And then, of course, the stalwart and steady humility. We won't spend too much time on that one, but, years ago when I first started being interested in this, the reason I started was like 6 or 7 years ago when I noticed relationships in the office where I worked they were just really struggling. And I started reading lots of things about it. And I saw an article on humble bosses make the best boss. Turned out it was pointing out that there were all these researchers out there who were finally acknowledging that there was a trait that executives had who were successful. And that trait was their ability to be humble. And you can see it played out in lots of different places where there are executives and great leaders who are lauded, that they would often have to acknowledge that they don't know everything, and I got to surround myself with people who know more than I do. And so humility plays so much in so many important places that it's important that we bring ourselves straight to it. And thankfully we have our faith that encourages that. So that's good. Today, and this podcast, I'd really like to emphasize this next one, which is really, the leaders that I've seen. By the way, the people that I've witnessed these behaviors in and these mindsets don't necessarily have to be Catholic. Perhaps they were raised on the fumes of Christianity. Who knows? But they exhibited these behaviors, and they might have had very different worldviews than I did. But they benefited from the fruits of these conversations and these behaviors because I saw joy in their relationships. I saw that they were sort of stalwart in their positions on things, but their life was very rich. Even through struggle, their life was rich. So they would, engage in these behaviors, the gratitude, the goodwill, the humility, and then especially this emphasis on dignity rather than identity. So I want to spend a lot more time on that today. Dignity, the respect of dignity as opposed to identity. And then finally, I think courage in relentless pursuit of the truth. So those are just a handful. And as we talk through it, we're going to mention others of the virtues, but that's between us girls, right? This is really about how do we translate so much of what is true here from scripture and from our faith. How do we translate it and articulate it to people who aren't familiar with it in the secular world in a way that's loving, that is understanding, and brings real goodness and truth into the world?
I like it. Gratitude, goodwill, humility, dignity, and courage.
Yeah. Yeah. So you want to talk about Joan? Joan is my
Yes.
fictional character. Okay. So Joan's fictional, but, I've seen Joan frequently. I'm not going to say that all women in the secular world are Joan. I'm going to say that there are a handful of women who succumb to the influences that create Joan. And for the 40 years that I worked in my career, I had a lot of different roles that I played, worked in marketing, product management, finance, but mostly as a sales manager. And I had leadership responsibilities. The point of within the past 10 years, I was asked to develop the content for and facilitate an executive women in leadership mentoring program. So these were women who were selected, and the company is very large. So there's 100,000 people, and there were 15 women each year who were selected by their managers to participate in this. And these were up and coming women, very bright, lots of tremendous potential, and the confidence and skill set to be leaders of the organization. So it was a select group. And I had influence on what the content was, and I wanted to make sure that it was rigorous in a way that they felt at the end of a year accomplished and more confident, and that their relationships with many, many executives at different levels were positive and influential. And so I had to do a fair amount of pushing back on some materials that often people wanted to bring in, and I wanted it to be real, actual, work that they did. And it ended up being very successful. But some of them, there were, I'd say a smaller number, would come in and would start out, say, with a dinner. And instead of gratitude, let's say Joan was one of our friends joining, she had, like I said, succumbed to the pressure of being resentful towards men. So she felt that she was going to be joining this club of women who had also had resentment towards men. And her words were very competitive towards men and angry towards men. And so she really wasn't self-aware that in her reality, the people who recommended her to come into this program were men. So, so she was kind of angry. So I know everyone knows what I'm talking about, because there are these behaviors that are sort of prevalent and encouraged. So poor Joan didn't have gratitude. And the other thing about Joan is that she was very bright. And long before Joan showed up, I think she learned her behaviors were reinforced. And just like I mentioned before, instead of having goodwill towards people, if somebody disagreed with her, she might express contempt. And so generally, someone like me coming in, there was that jarring feeling that I felt. There's something toxic here. There's something not right. It doesn't feel right, because I'm recalling that dinner table conversation when I was 7, right? And that's passing on to this. And so she struggles with that. She's probably not humble, because Joan may be put into a situation where she is inserting herself in front of a customer. And even though that customer has somebody in their operations area who holds on to a spreadsheet that was important to that operations area for 30 years, Joan has a technology that's going to fix all the problems, and she doesn't need to talk to the person who has the spreadsheet. She doesn't care about the person who has the spreadsheet. She thinks that she has all the answers, because the reality is Mary over here, who has the spreadsheet, has some real important details that could be catastrophic if they're not transferred to the right people. I once did a presentation to 500 financial professionals at a conference in Boston, and the subject was, the financial professional of the future will be highly technically proficient, but will they be able to communicate? And the answer is no, because that is that humility piece. And then
I'm nodding my head. Sorry, people can't see me, but I'm nodding my head, because all these things that you're bringing up, this perceived shared belief that she has, this idea that she doesn't need to talk to other people outside of her area or outside of her zone. And in these big companies, especially, and I hear this from my husband all the time in his workplace. It's a wonderful company, but there's such a disconnect. There's such a lack of communication between different levels. And there's all these different pieces that are supposed to be working together, but they don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
And it causes all kinds of problems.
Yes, and that's a perfect lead into this piece on dignity rather than identity, because I think that a lot of that dissonance that you just described that your husband was experiencing is because there's a different treatment for different people in different places, and then also based on their identity, right? So when we treat people differently, we all can go back to, Jesus sitting around the dinner table with the tax collector, the homeless person, the sick person, the robber, name them all. They weren't highly regarded in society because of their identities. What I'm suggesting here is an emphasis on dignity rather than identity, because as you described in your husband's workplace and consistent across the board, there are, HR departments that are emphasizing certain identities. There are also status based on your position, right? And I'm suggesting that every conversation matters. It doesn't matter if it's in the boardroom or the mailroom. It doesn't matter if it's in the water cooler. The behaviors that I see these great leaders exhibit, they're the same everywhere. And that's, there's a big trend around authentic leadership. Well, what does authentic leadership mean? Are you the same person when you're talking to somebody in the mailroom as you are to the executive? A lot of people can't answer that question positively. And it's not that those individual people that you're speaking with are going to have something to say about it because they're focused on your conversation. It's the people around you who witness it and witness how different you are with different people. You probably see it in the sports world, right? As you're coaching your daughter's teams and, people, if you're the coach, they're going to be really nice to you,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe not, right? So it's a natural human behavior, but it's something I'm suggesting to be conscious of.
I'm just thinking, sorry.
No, no.
But if you ever hear someone answer the phone and you can almost guess who they're talking to by the way that they start talking,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
because they just talk differently or I can tell when my husband is talking to his best friend or when he is talking to his dad versus his mom just by the things that he says and the
Sure.
way that he
Yeah.
says them.
Yeah.
And I know I'm the same way. I mean, I think most people are, and that doesn't mean we're authentically different, but we
Mhm.
just show up different in different conversations.
Yeah. And I do think that some of that is fine because you have different relationships with different people and that's true. It's when one is prioritized more,
Yes.
which is what's really different. And that's what I see my friend Joan doing. She's buying into these sort of narratives. And, I think what the struggle is that she's being asked to assume that certain identities are suffering more than other identities, right? And my question is, how do you know the degree of one's suffering unless you actually have a conversation? How do you understand somebody's perspective unless you have a conversation? And when we think about the word perspective, our perspective is all that we have, and it's unique for each individual. And it's based on millions of years of evolution, thousands of years of history and tradition, or millions of identities, not just five, or millions of identities. I'm talking about things like birth order, energy level. Energy level is the one thing that people never talk about. We just talked about some with the temperaments, right? That's another thing. But, I like to think about energy because we're on such a vast plane of energetic levels that you've got some people who are highly energetic and outgoing, and some people have introverted energy, and we all fall somewhere in between. And our differences are like, on that scientific scale, 0.0000, right? So you've got that. The degree to which you experience that identity makes our differences to infinity. And so, what was shocking to me in the corporate world, this was 10, 15 years ago, I would attend these management trainings and they would have these, highly regarded, excellent researchers And they were promoting these ideas that, okay, if you're a manager and you're talking to a millennial, here's your cheat sheet, because all millennials think the same. If you have a Gen Z, here's your cheat sheet. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, if there's 100,000 employees and we have all these different identities, the degree to which we experience those identities is to infinity. Like, how many cheat sheets do I need? How many cheat sheets do I need? And then as a manager, there's a tremendous responsibility that I'm having to take on, because I'm the one who is being told it's up to you whether the other person's feelings are going to be hurt or not. So when I would start getting into these trainings, here's where I used personally the last behavior or mindset, and that was courage to relentlessly pursue the truth. And I would ask the question, what about an alternative training to this? What if we considered this idea that there's 100% chance that you will be insulted over the course of your life and your career? How you respond to that insult will define the trajectory of it. And that's Carla's salty kitchen science training, because that is the truth. The onus, like some people who are very strong personalities, sometimes they can emote their anger and their resentment, like this character Joan. In her case, she may, be someone who buys into this, but she's also has this resentment and she's emotional. She's going to express an emotional reaction when she sees things that don't line up with her narrative, or if she's easily offended. And I'm saying to Joan, as an alternative, how can we help Joan be, transition out of this thinking? Because ultimately the message here is, how can we use our conversations to be helpful to Joan, who's been lost in this whirlpool? And I think that the best antidote, and this is where courage comes in, is to first and foremost sit with Joan and listen to her with open-ended questions. There are a couple people who do research, Donna Hicks and Chris Voss. Donna Hicks is a researcher from Harvard. She does a lot of high stakes between conflicting countries and world events. And she's a negotiator, but she emphasizes leading with dignity. And she speaks to this idea that you have to respect the person across the table from you, first and foremost, and respect them for their dignity, even though there are lots of things they may have said about your country. But she emphasizes the importance of dignity. And Chris Voss does the same thing. He's a negotiator, does high stakes hostage kinds of negotiations. And you wouldn't think that this is the thing that makes a difference. But when, in those situations, he would sit with the person, it's the drug cartel leader on the other end of the phone, saying, I know you have 5 people at the bank it held hostage. What is it that you want? Right? So he was asking these open-ended questions. And you're a coach, you know what I'm talking about, right? The open-ended questions. So it starts opening up a dialogue, because again, as Catholics, we know that this is a little bit of a relay race as opposed to a single run, a single sprint that we're doing. We are likely starting to put the beginning touches of the tile or artwork or the fresco of the cathedral. We're not going to ever see the cathedral done. So that, relay race metaphor is that we are starting the race and we're going to hand the baton to God afterwards, because we aren't not necessarily responsible for Joan's full transition, but we can use our conversations and this respect for dignity to introduce her to something new and fresh and beautiful.
I have so many follow-up questions. First of all, I think Joan is highly choleric, and she has not had anyone to ever help her temper that. That is actually one of the things. Connie Rossini has a wonderful book on children with a choleric temperament and how to help raise them and grow them in the spiritual life. And that is one of the things she talks about. She says cholerics can become tyrants like Hitler if they are not instructed in recognizing their impulse to anger, right? And so learning how to lean into their leadership qualities, right? Which is why Jonah's in this group. She has all these wonderful qualities that could make her a great leader. But if she doesn't learn to recognize that she actually isn't always right, which is what her mind is telling her, is that she's always right and she can't see the faults of everybody else because the choleric struggles with pride, then that is where you get the tyrant. But
Wow.
cholerics and melancholics are the most likely to become saints because they do have these incredible virtues in there, but we just have to have people to help guide us. And that is what I think you're talking about with these conversations. And what I'm hearing is that really people need to be heard. And when
Yes.
you're in such a large organization, it takes time to
Mm.
have meaningful conversations. And
Mhm.
we don't take the time, which I think we can all relate to, even in our own homes, is not feeling like there's enough time to sit down and have the conversation because we're so busy. But I remember going to a training on communication and they asked for a volunteer and they went up to the front and they said, we're just going to talk about conversations and just letting people feel heard. And instead of asking, hey, how are you? Because the typical response is, I'm good. I'm fine. Right. And we might not be fine, but that's just the expected answer. So that's what we say. It was something like, hey, tell me about your day. So she starts talking and then you just wait and say, what else? And by the end, this woman was in tears because she had a horrible morning, a horrible, horrible morning. And all these things were going on. But if we just say, how are you? It doesn't open up that conversation in the same way. And so when you talk about dignity and just seeing the person on a human level, that's what I'm getting. Do you ever feel like no matter how much you accomplish, you're still overwhelmed? Like you're spinning all the plates, work, family, faith, but something is always slipping. You know you should be putting God first, but in the chaos of life, prayer feels like another task on your to-do list. It doesn't have to be this way. Imagine waking up with clarity, knowing your life is rightly ordered, your priorities are aligned, and you're no longer running on stress and self-doubt. Imagine your relationships thriving because you're showing up as the woman God created you to be, present, at peace, and deeply connected to Him. That's exactly what my 12-week one-on-one coaching program is designed to do. Together, we create a plan of life that integrates faith, work, and family without burnout. You learn how to let go of stress, stop overanalyzing, and trust God's plan while taking action in the areas you can control. The best part, you'll experience a transformation that doesn't just impact you. It overflows into your marriage, your children, your friendships. When you live with balance and peace, everyone around you benefits. But don't wait. Now is the time to start. The life God is calling you to isn't one of exhaustion and anxiety. It's one of peace and order and joy. Spots are limited, so sign up for a free confidence and clarity call right now by clicking the link in the show notes.
Yeah. I absolutely, I love that you're spotting this out and you're sort of spotting these things and you're sort of reconciling it to these other sort of studies that you've done on temperaments and things like that, because it helps me to understand, is this true? Like I always like to take this material that I've observed over 40 years that is of my time, however short that is, to reconcile against other things, because I think, I just want it to be true. I want it to be true, and I want to make sure that it's factual. So that helps me, to understand that.
Yeah. This is so beautiful. My question for you as we're going through this is, how do you respond when you're the person on the receiving end of being treated as the identity or the status level of where you are in your company or whatever your status quo is in life versus the person who is instigating the conversation? Maybe they're the higher up, they're the president or they're the VP and you're in the mailroom.
Yes, yes. So not every situation can be addressed this way. We have to, I think, first and foremost, it's about the prayer, it's about the sacraments, it's about, all of the things that we have in our faith that prepares, like I say, this armor to say, I have personally been in situations where I know that I was going to have a conflict with somebody, or we already did have a conflict. And in this particular situation, God had me invite this person to dinner, and it was one-on-one. I wouldn't have done it on my own.
Yeah.
And I got this message, invite the person to dinner. And I remember standing, waiting to get seated, saying, Holy Spirit, you better show up because I can't do this by myself. And it was in that experience that I ended up, knowing that there was going to be conflict in the conversation. There was conflict, but somehow the Holy Spirit gave me the words, gave me the direction. And the next day, this person sent me a note thanking me for the dinner. Okay. So we as Catholics, that's the answer. But if you don't have that, helping in some way to be a transition agent, oftentimes when someone is emotional, one of the most impactful things that you can do, and this takes some courage, is to not be emotional. Now, I talk about temperance as part of the things that we need to bring in. But again, between us girls, we know that managing your emotions when you're talking to somebody else and they're expressing these ideas, oftentimes they're emotional. And it's almost like there's something else coming into the conversation, or perhaps someone else that's toxic, that doesn't belong in that conversation. And you know it, and you're on the receiving end. You don't have to receive that. You can visualize, whether it's a Catholic sacramental or visual, maybe it's a cross or something that can help you visualize taking that emotion that's coming from the other person and sort of setting it aside and remaining calm. That act in and of itself is going to be respectful of the person, and they're going to calm down. They're really going to bring themselves to a place where they can then begin a discussion. So I would say start there. Now, when people in the secular world, I grew up in the 70s, so I have all these cartoons in my mind, how I would use, the storm cloud above the Munster's house is everyone knows what we're talking about, 1313 Mockingbird Lane. I've said this to people. Look, if you grew up in the 70s, or if you've ever watched the show, you've got this beautiful neighborhood, and then you have this haunted house with bats, quintessential forever perpetual storm and lightning and all that. You can choose to see that storm above your conversation part, above Joan. That storm is over Joan's head. When you give Joan feedback, or you're trying to be present for Joan, it doesn't mean that you have to take that storm on. One of the biggest things that I've seen in the sort of difficulty between a manager, as an example, and a direct report who needs to get feedback, is that the manager sometimes is afraid to deliver the feedback, because when the receiver of the feedback gets emotional, they assume the emotion. They take the cloud and they own it as part of them. And then you have this chaos in the room, and then nothing gets done. So there's got to be a way for you to avoid taking on what I think is, in some cases, a demon into your own heart. How do you prevent that? So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. And I think recognizing that locus of control, their emotions are their emotions. My emotions are my emotions. But I know exactly what you're talking about. I remember sitting in a parent meeting. It was the parent and the principal. And the mom was like, "You're so quiet. Just tell me what you need to tell me." But she could sense in me, like, I didn't want to say certain things because I had been attacked so many times for telling the truth about kids. Right. And so she could sense that in me, that I was just at that point in the year where I was like, I just don't feel like being attacked today. I don't feel like being attacked today. And she wasn't. She was a super supportive mom. But when you have to tell a parent that their kid cheated on something, you blatantly caught them. And the parent will attack you and tell you that it's your fault, that their kid either wouldn't do that, or if you didn't make the class so hard, or if everyone wasn't failing, they just come up with all these assumptions in their brain because it's hard for them to accept that their kid would have done something like that. And it's hard for them to accept that their kid is going to have consequences for what happened, right? So, again, just like you're talking about, I start receiving all of these emotions from them and start getting all these thoughts, which we know our thoughts lead to our own emotions. And so I start getting all these thoughts about like, how I'm a terrible person. I must have done something wrong, which is not the case, right? That
Yeah.
wasn't the case. But when you've had that repeated pattern so many times,
Mhm.
you do start to have feelings about wanting to give feedback,
Right.
and it
Right.
can be difficult.
It is very difficult. And they're entitled to their emotions. So it's
Yes.
not like you are in a position to say, well, you shouldn't be feeling that. Like they are feeling those emotions. I think that when you start with putting a sort of a blockade to make sure that you're not impacted, and then you can express compassion towards them and understand,
Hmm.
this is difficult to accept. And at the same time, because you were the teacher who had the observations, you had the details, you opened up your binder and turned to the page, missing homework. Right.
Yes.
And I think that that is when you have the facts, it's really important to be able to say them in a calm way. And also bringing back to goodwill, I really believe in your son, or I believe in your daughter. I think he or she has this great potential. These are the things that, I think where we need to start. And he's got to meet me halfway, kind of thing, right? Does
Yes.
that feel familiar?
Yes. And
Yeah.
I think coaching was so transformational for me of just understanding this relationship between our thoughts and our emotions and understanding locus of control because we're not taught these things, most of us.
Yeah.
And just like you said, knowing the facts.
Mhm.
I could know the facts in my head, but actually writing out what are the facts and what
Yes.
are just my thoughts about this situation
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
having that distinction. And most of the time I could do that okay. But, like I said, after it's a repeated pattern again and again and again,
Yeah.
you start to doubt yourself. You start to
Yes.
doubt your abilities because, unfortunately, in the education world, this is just where we're at right now. This is just kind of the culture.
Mhm.
And it's challenging. But I really started to shift and looked at this is a phrase that one of my coworkers always said, assume positive intent, right? Assume positive intent of the other person. And
Yes.
so I'd always try to do that. And especially after becoming a mom, I could start to understand more of where they're coming from. They're protective. They want
Mhm.
to protect their kid and they can't recognize sometimes that they are enabling them.
Yes.
And
And
so
it's
I,
difficult for them. Yeah. It's difficult for them because I've witnessed that too. They reach a certain age and they have these ideals and visions of their child being, excelling socially, excelling academically, excelling athletically. And then they realize, well, they're not good at one or more of those things. And that's a disappointment to me because I wasn't good at those things either. Right. So it
mm,
actually becomes a little bit about them. So they're suffering too. And so as a teacher, there's a lot on your shoulders because you're transitioning them to see what's true about their child and to really see where the beautiful opportunities are, but they might be caught up in something that's about them.
mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
really hard. It's really hard. But all of these conversations, knowing that you have some opportunity to introduce these virtues and these behaviors should give people a feeling of hope. Because I think
Mm,
when you think of the overarching sort of, in some ways, tyranny that's happening in different places or the issues that occur and that you're hearing about that are marginalizing different groups and just so much pain and suffering around us, there's a feeling of being overwhelmed and hopeless and helpless.
mm,
But when you think about this tremendous portal that you have in front of you, it should give you a sense of agency, a sense of empowerment in a way that says, all I can do is something every day, the average person has about 27 conversations a day. So you're going to be busy. You're going to be busy bringing these things into your conversations and being friendly to the bus driver, listening to the bus driver. Because if you do all the, sort of philanthropic activities you want, but if you forget about that bus driver on your way to work, that's really a failing right there. And I'm not saying that we all get it right, but the awareness of it helps us to do it better more times.
Mm-hmm. And just understanding, I think giving ourselves permission to not be perfect at it.
Mhm.
I know in my Strengths Finder assessment, pulling in all these assessments, but that's what a lot of coaches are trained in is Strengths Finder. And one of mine is Relator, which means like small, intimate, deeper conversations, right? That is where I thrive. And I would struggle sometimes in a classroom setting or in a coaching, athletics, because I wanted those deeper conversations with kids. But when you have a team of 25 girls, you can't have deep conversations with 25 people every day. You can't even have all 25 in a week. It's
Yeah,
just not possible. So then people feel left out and then they start to get their own thoughts about I'm not important or she cares more about that person than me, which is never the intent versus
sure.
someone else who maybe is more quantity of conversations
Yeah,
that don't
interesting.
go as deep. And so it's just fascinating. And I've learned to just recognize that in other people's coaching styles in athletics and how that plays out, you know,
Wow.
and trying to find a balance. But all of these things about communication and conversation, I think are important to recognize because when we see other people having conversations or when we get feedback that is not great toward us about our conversations or the way that we do things, it's just recognizing all of these gifts are needed. We need both types of conversations. They're both important. Saying hello to the bus driver for 30 seconds is important.
Yes, it is. Yes. So it could be the single thing that gives that individual bus driver some moment of hope, some moment of positivity in their day to the point they pass it on to somebody else. And that changes the world. I'm convinced that what we do in our individual conversations will all add up and really transform the world, one conversation at a time.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
so powerful. I love that. This has been so good. I just want to recap one more time kind of what your 5 keys were. So the first was gratitude, coming into
Hmm.
conversation with gratitude, having goodwill, not contempt or malice. Humility, I think, is so huge. Always, I think of our Blessed Mother. And then dignity. So seeing the other person's dignity versus their cultural identity, not their identity in Christ, right? Like our Catholic
Yeah.
identity that we can see people as, but the identity maybe in the social status, right? So looking at their dignity.
Yeah.
And then this last one I think is so important, courage in relentless pursuit of the truth. And you and I had talked about this off air about how important it is to have difficult conversations. Like the health of a relationship is in your ability to have a difficult conversation and find the truth.
Yeah.
And so often we avoid those conversations because they're difficult, or we don't know how to have those conversations because it can lead to conflict if we don't have two people who are willing to engage in healthy debate.
Yeah. Hmm. And it's why I think in so many ways our civil discourse has failed because, I heard Bishop Barron describe one time the difference between an argument and a quarrel. And an argument is two people sharing information and facts and data and synthesizing that data and moving the issue forward. They may not agree on everything in the end, but they're moving it forward. A quarrel is an ad hominem attack against somebody.
Hmm.
And so that you can immediately see when the truth is not being pursued because And I've witnessed this over and over and over again recently. Like, over the past 10 years, it's gotten worse, where it's an attack on an individual. I don't want to hear any more about that fact. You are just a bad person because of this identity or the way you think. And that is a degradation of our civil discourse. Whereas we can have healthy debates and arguments that lift each other up and lift our relationships up. So
That courage piece, I just keep going back to it because I was actually just in scripture this morning. I happened to flip open my Bible and I couldn't tell you the verse, but it was talking about having the courage to speak the truth. And oh gosh, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but it was even talking about sexual immorality, like just having the courage to speak up.
mm-hmm.
And that is challenging. And that
It
is
is. Yeah.
difficult because we know that we're going to have persecution. We know that people are going to disagree. Even if you look at, I don't love talking about politics, but even all the different discourse that has shown up in the past few days over gender is male
Yes.
and female.
Yes.
And those who have a whole nother realm of possibilities. And we have to be able to talk about it. We have to be able to talk about it and not degrade someone who thinks differently.
Right. And it doesn't mean judgment over the other person. That's not for us
Right.
to do. That's we're not here to judge. It's still being respectful of the dignity of the individual, but pursuing the truth in a way that can we look at all aspects of and the impacts of these decisions that people want to make in certain situations, right? Let's look at all of the components of it so that we're fully informed when we make a decision. And if it's true, it will hold, right? The morality or the biblical nature of it, if it's true, it will be true and it will emerge as truth because of these conversations, because we're bringing these virtues in.
I think this is the perfect segue into our prayer tip / scripture verse that I always close every episode with. You gave me Philippians chapter 4, verses 8 and 9.
Yes.
Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious. If there is any excellence and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep on doing what you have learned and received and heard in me, and the God of peace will be with you.
Love it.
Do you have anything you want to add? Why is that verse so important to you?
Well, I think that it really does, with all of this richness in the teachings of the faith and biblical scripture, it does help me to see the tactical way of entering into the day and entering into our conversations. Look for the beauty, look for truth, and be joyful while we do it. And that's the gratitude that comes through. So there's so much about that resonates. And I think that forever I'll be trying to study what else is in there, because it's a lifetime worth of learning.
Yeah. I always love this verse 9, keep on doing what you have learned and received and heard in me. Sometimes when I feel stuck, I'm like, Lord, I don't know what to do. And I just think of this verse, like, what do you know to be true? What do you already know about me? So if we're thinking about conversations or communication, how did Jesus speak to people? How did he engage with them? What have we learned? What do we know? And then you just keep doing that thing.
Yes. And it doesn't mean that he just let things lie that weren't true. I mean, he turned tables, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was salty too on certain occasions.
Justified anger.
Yes. Yeah. So I think there's so much inspiration at every level.
And saying, go and sin no more. He had the conversation, but he wasn't afraid to speak the truth. And I am constantly praying for that courage to be able to do that more often, because that is one of my challenges. So I we'll continue to pray for that virtue. That last one that you said, the courage.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank
It's
you
all
so
important.
much for joining. I know your website, I think, will be up by the time this airs, but what is the name of the website where people can find you?
It will be carlakreeman.com.
Awesome. I will put it in the show notes if you don't know how to spell Krieman. And Carla, I just want to say thank you. This has been delightful conversation, and it's so fun to just have another perspective, your business perspective of being in that environment, I think is new and fresh to the podcast. So I just want to say thank you.
And thank you. Thanks for having me. This is a fabulous portal to pass on, a different perspective around the faith. And I'm just delighted to experience it. You've been a great interviewer. Thank you.
Beautiful souls, thank you again for journeying with me. If you have been blessed by this episode, it would mean the world to me if you would leave a review. Be sure to screenshot it, share it on your social media stories, and don't forget to tag me on Instagram or Facebook at Kylie M. Hein. Stay persistent in prayer, protect your peace, and as always, share the light of Christ with everyone around you.